Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Bunny Space Industries, where I go super autistic on you all and just ramble on about space shit, and you force to sit there and listen. Sorry, not sorry. Space is cool. Ask Markiplier. I'm doing the thing again where I'm pointing and like putting things here, but I'm probably gonna have like a picture of him in front of me. I'm gonna try and put more videos in as well because I didn't do any videos for last time. This episode is cool because we're gonna be talking about the Orion command module, or the Orion uh, spacecraft, part of the SLS space launch system, which you can see. Poof! Probably a picture of it in front of me now. Shut up, phone. I know how to do this. I'm doing filmmaker stuff. Okay. Shit. I lost my place. Here we go. So the Orion space capsule, or splashdown module, command module, whatever you want to call it, is what the astronauts pilot the SLS from once it's in space. The command module is the splashdown module, and it's the module where they do all the piloting from. It's the one that they sit in and fly around the moon, and then either land or come back. For Artemis 2, they'll be using it just to go around the moon. This is very similar to the Apollo command module, which served the same function. It was designed to have the pilots operate the Apollo or the Saturn V spacecraft from. Well, the Saturn V is just a rocket that puts up. The Apollo is the splashdown module, the command module. It's all that cool little triangle. And if you look at the Orion and the Apollo, they look very similar in design. They have similar shape. They have similar window sizes. Sorry, my phone is going off. I'm awful at this. Yeah, now it's on vibrate. They have similar shapes, similar ways in which they re-enter, similar ways for the heat shielding. But there's also a lot of differences. Where the Apollo and the Orion look very similar is in design, because the shape works. NASA proved with the Apollo that the shape of the Orion and the Apollo just works. So they used it again for the Orion. But where the Orion and the Apollo differ are, I have a few things I've written down. The size, the Orion spacecraft is larger than the Apollo command module, within 30% more habitable space, meaning they have much more space to move around than the Apollo crew ever did. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong are jealous. They're jealous of their Orion. They're jealous of their command module, and I don't blame them. The Apollo crew, they weren't cramped and squished in beside each other, there was still not much movable space and habitable space in it. Where the Orion is much bigger, has more habitable space. At 26 feet long and a 16.5 feet diameter, while the Apollo command module has a 12 feet 10-inch diameter and 11 feet by 5 inches tall. So pretty big, pretty much bigger. Crew capacity, the Orion can transport up to 4 crew members for 21 days, while the Apollo was designed to transport 3 crew members for 14 days. So you can stay in it much longer and stay in space. My phone's being weird. Don't worry about that. The Orion has a glass cockpit, while with touch-sensitive screens and digital controls, while the Apollo had many physical switches and buttons. Physical switches and buttons are cool. I'm sure the Orion has some kind of backup system that is analog in case something goes wrong with the digital system. But the new system, the Orion, has a lot of touchy screen stuff, which we fucking love touchscreens. Touchscreens are cool. My phone's a touchscreen. Power source. The Orion's European Service Module, the ESM, provides power, propulsion, and thermal control. The Apollo Service Module will contain a fuel cell that produces electricity and water. So it has a better power supply. So far, everything's seeming like it's a massive upgrade from the Apollo. Where the similarities is they looked similar, but that's where it ends. The Orion is a much, much better upgrade. Not that Apollo wasn't great for its time, but I mean, it was for its time. It was for 1960s, 1970s, not 2024 going into 2025. The heat shield on the Orion has an improved heat shield design. The Apollo had an ablative heat shield that protected the command module from reentry heat. We'll get into the Orion's heat shield in a little bit, because this episode is also about the issues they're having with that heat shielding, which is a bit of a lot. But they're working on it, they're figuring it out, they know the problem, and they're solving it. How did I get back there? And then splashdown. The Orion splashdown capabilities are designed for more extreme reentry conditions than the Crew Dragon. So it's just designed to splash down at a higher velocity coming from outer space and not orbit. I don't know why I said outer space. That felt weird. I don't know. Now let's get into the Orion itself. So the Orion, let me see if I can find my notes. Also known as the Orion Return to Earth. Oh, and that's how it's going to return to Earth. I have this written down. So the Orion is both the command module to pilot the Orion through space and to go around the moon, but that's only part of it. It's also connected to the service module, which would hold the boosters, thrusters, and any other like electronic parts, and that's not going to re-enter because that stays in orbit. The Orion is just the part that the crew sits in. Now, the problem the Orion is having is its heat shielding is being damaged at a much higher rate than they suspected, with massive holes and chunks taken out of the heat shielding that is concerning to NASA. If NASA does anything, is it does not fuck around with heat shielding issues. They learned that with Columbia. Rest in peace, Columbia. But they learned that from Columbia. Columbia's disaster allowed them to learn exactly why you don't brush off the heat shielding having an issue. The heat shielding is not working. The entire craft is not spaceworthy. So they're right now working on trying to figure it out. They discovered the problem is that it's heating up and breaking apart at a much higher rate. I've written that here. So, yeah, the AVCO is what they put on the bottom for the heat shielding. So what they're using for heat shielding wore away differently than NASA engineers predicted, cracking and breaking off the spacecraft in fragments that created a trail of debris rather than melting away as designed. So it's designed to break apart, but in much tiny little dusty pieces, and then just fly up over the side. Whereas this one is causing huge chunks of debris to fly off, which, if it collides into the craft while it's descending or re-entering, could see it explode, like we saw with the Columbia. In response, NASA said that it is working on resolving the issue either way, replacing heat shielding components or altering Orion's re-entry trajectory. So basically, the two things they're going to do is either they're going to completely redo and change the entirety of what the Orion's heat shielding is to be something else, moving away from AVCO entirely, possibly, or finding out if there's a different re-entry protocol that they can do that allows the heat shield to heat up less quickly. What that is, I don't know. I'm not a NASA scientist. I'm not a space engineer. I'm just a guy who likes looking on the internet about space stuff and is obsessed with space. I am not an expert when it comes to heat shielding, science, space engineering, any of that. So I don't know how the science of any of that works. I just know what NASA's telling me. So currently, the re-entry for the Orion is the Orion separates from the service module. The Orion crew capsule basically there's a raised berm where it flips over, so the curved part is facing the Earth. The Orion crew capsule hits atmosphere. The crew capsule skips on Earth's atmosphere a little bit. It does a little bit of like you ever like take a rock and you throw it across an ocean, or not? Throw it across an ocean. What am I, freaking Hercules? A pond or a lake, and it bounces off the surface. It's doing that, but in the atmosphere because it's very thick around Earth. Not entirely too thick where like, you know, sunlight can't get through, like Mars or Venus, or I don't know what that was. That was like my freaking light being weird. but it's very thick. And then the parachutes deploy, and then it splashes down. Ideally, with no issues at all, because the last thing we want is to have our astronauts' lives at risk. We need to make sure that they are ultimately safe, or people are too afraid to go to space. Because when it comes to NASA, human life is not just a resource to them. It's how do I say this without sounding insane or weird? It's priority number one. You need to make sure the astronauts are alive when they re-enter and come back to Earth. Or then people don't want to go to space if you're, going to go to space and no longer be alive. Not everybody is me and Markiplier who want to go to space even if it means we'll die. So that's the Orion module. Now, the command module also had issues. The Apollo command module also had issues with its heat shielding and a lot of other issues. So, the Apollo's heat shielding was fiberglass honeycomb shell. The outer layer of the heat shield was made of fiberglass honeycomb shell. The phonic epoxy resin, the shell was within a... So, sorry, my camera cut off for a second there. The shell was a phonic epoxy resin called AvCoat. So, they are still using the same thing they used on the Apollo, the AvCoat. But it's seeming to have a different issue than it did then. It's breaking apart much more than they thought it would. Had brazed steel honeycomb substructure, quartz fibers, and so that's the construction of it. Don't I have something? The Apollo, using a special adhesive to attach fiberglass honeycomb sections to the spacecraft stainless steel outer shell and then heat bonding them in a large oven. That's how NASA fixed the heat shield issue on the Apollo, which I assume it's having the same issue they're having now since it's both AvCoat. This is a completely opinionated speculation, but since they're both using AvCoat, it's a possibility they're both having the same issue. Whereas the Apollo had an issue with it breaking up, and they solved it by adding an adhesive fiberglass honeycomb sections onto the AvCoat. And possibly doing the same with Orion could give us the same problem fixed. But what NASA's going to do, we still do not know. There's also other options they can go with. They can go with, if they can't use the Orion spacecraft at all, they can go with what they call Orion Light, which is a stripped down version of the Orion spacecraft, where it's like a basic like life support, water production, navigation controls, communications, and that's it. There's nothing else special. It's all flippy lever switches and physical buttons. But as of right now, they're not planning on using a stripped down version of Orion. They're planning on using the actual Orion. If the Orion spacecraft can't be fixed for the Artemis 2 mission, NASA could delay the launch by another year or more. Which, if they can't fix it by the launch date of 2025, is likely what they're going to do, mostly because they're not going to risk 4 astronauts' lives for a mission that's going to end in failure. NASA is not a gambling company, it's a science company. And gambling is not science. Remember that, kids. Gambling isn't science. Fixing the heat shielding would require partially dismantling the spacecraft, making experiments reconnecting its spacecraft, and likely redoing some of the pre-flight tests. So, likely what they're probably going to do is something similar, my speculation is something similar they did with the Apollo, where they basically cover the bottom AvCoat with a honeycomb fiberglass sections that will help reduce the heat, and then it'll burn away as it needs to. Or they can completely redesign the entire Orion spacecraft's heat shielding and completely do a new test. Which means 2025, instead of it being a manned flight, could possibly, if they have to redesign the Orion's heat shielding, be another unmanned test of the Orion craft, where they go up, they go around, it goes around the moon, and it comes back, and we see how it does. And then 2026 or 2027 is when we send the 4 astronauts we have. Hopefully, they don't have to completely redesign the heat shielding, and we're still go for launch on 2025 for the Artemis 2 manned flight around the moon. That's what I'm hoping, at least. There's also a few other issues with the heat shielding damage. There was melting bolts. 4 separation bolts on the base of the heat shield melted and eroded. That's not good. Char loss. The heat shield wore away unexpectedly in over 100 locations. Geez, 100 locations over a large area is a lot. And there's charred material. The charred material was released in a different manner than predicted by computer modules. So those are the issues they're currently currently working to fix. I'm wishing it was already fixed so we could put the fucking astronauts to space already. But, you know, wishing isn't how science works. So, with any luck, by 2025, we have Weissman, Glover, Cook, and Hansen flying around the moon in something the size of a freaking small bus. But only time will tell. But for now, I'm going to try the new outro. Stay curious, love science, love space, go to the moon.